This is Tokens. I'm Lee C. Camp.
This was actually in November of 1990, and I got this strange request.
That's Randall Balmer, an Episcopal priest, historian, and professor of religion at the Ivy League's Dartmouth College.
I was invited to Washington, D.C. for a gathering that was ostensibly a celebration of the 10 years anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency.
This invitation turned out to be the beginning of Randall's work piecing together the origins of the so-called religious right. What he has uncovered over the years is as eye-opening as it is, troubling.
In the middle decades of the 20th century, many evangelicals didn't bother to vote, certainly not in any organized way, until the 1970s. Nothing got their attention until the IRS in the 1970s began coming after so-called segregation academies.
His findings are compiled in his new book, Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right, in which he comes to the surprising conclusion.
This movement, that is the political mobilization of evangelical voters, and I hate to say this, I always clutch when I start to complete the sentence. It was a movement that was begun to defend racial segregation.
Randy has some stories to tell. Our interview in just a moment. Our guest today is Randall Balmer. Randall Balmer graduated from Trinity College and Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, then earned his PhD from Princeton University. He was a professor of American Religious History at Columbia University for 27 years before moving to Dartmouth College in 2012. His commentaries have appeared in newspapers and online publications around the country. He was ordained an Episcopal priest in 2006, and he and his wife Catherine reside in Vermont and New Mexico. Today we're discussing his new book coming out from Erdman's Press entitled Bad Faith, Race and the Rise of the Religious Right. Welcome back again, Randy. Good to see you.
Hey, good to see you, Lee.
Always great to have a conversation with you. So, this new book, you describe in the start how a meeting you thought about not going to change the course of your academic career.
It makes you believe in providence, doesn't
it? Indeed. It also terrifies me to think about the no's I've said to invitations that maybe I should have said yes to.
Exactly. Yeah. This was actually in November of 1990, and I got this strange request. Actually, I thought it was strange at the time. I guess in retrospect, I do understand why I was invited. But I was invited to Washington, D.C. for a gathering that was ostensibly a celebration of the 10 years anniversary of Ronald Reagan's election to the presidency. And it sounded kind of interesting. And as I said, I almost did not go because, I was an assistant professor at the time, teaching, trying to care for a young family. And so only at the last minute, I decided, well, I'll go. And I found myself in a small conference room with the titans, really, of the religious right. Paul Weyrich, who's the architect of that whole movement. Ed Dobson, who had been one of Jerry Falwell's acolytes at Moral Majority before he went on to become a megachurch pastor in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Donald Wildman, who had started the American Family Association to protest bad things on television. Carl F.H. Henry, the founding editor of Christianity Today magazine, was there. Ralph Reed of the Christian Coalition was there. Richard Viguerie. It was kind of a who's who of the religious right. And I was in this room thinking, why am I here? And it just turned out to be an eye-opening experience.
So what did you learn there that was so significant for you?
Well, in the very first session, there was a conversation. Actually, there were a couple of historians there as well, wonderful friends of mine, Grant Wacker and George Marsden. And George Marsden had given a paper to kind of open the conversation, providing kind of a historical overview of evangelicals and politics and that sort of thing. And in the course of the discussion thereafter, Paul Weyrich gave a rather impassioned soliloquy. And he said, let's remember, abortion had nothing to do with the emergence of this movement, that is the political mobilization of evangelical voters. And As I listened to this, all of a sudden it just kind of clicked with me. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Because I spent the 1970s immersed in what I call the evangelical subculture. I was a student, as you said, at Trinity College and then at Trinity Divinity School. I was working in the development office for the Divinity School, and abortion simply wasn't part of the conversation. And so during the break after that first session, I went up to Wyrick and I said, I want to make sure I understood you correctly. Abortion had nothing to do with the genesis of this movement. He said, absolutely not. I'd been trying since the Goldwater campaign in 1964 to get evangelicals interested in politics and mobilized as a political group. He said, I tried everything. I tried the abortion issue. I tried the school prayer issue. I tried the Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. I tried the pornography issue. Nothing got their attention until, and here was the breakthrough, until the IRS in the 1970s began coming after so-called segregation academies and Bob Jones University, challenging their tax-exempt status because of racial segregation. So that moment was for me a breakthrough, and it really was the catalyst for my interest in this topic. And I've spent far more years, Lee, than I care to tally, trying to run this down. And I've determined that Wyrick was absolutely right. Abortion was not part of this. This was a movement that was generated to defend, and I hate to say this, I always clutch when I start to complete the sentence. It was a movement to defend racial segregation in evangelical institutions, notably Bob Jones University.
I do want to come back to that and dig into that a bit. But before we do, I want to step back in history, as you do in your book, and note that as you kind of sketch out the history of evangelicalism in the United States, you note that what we call evangelicalism looked like in the 19th century and even the early 20th century was very, very different than what the religious right has become. So would you describe a bit for us what it did look like in the 19th century?
Sure. I began to get a glimpse of this when I was an undergraduate history major at Trinity College a long, long time ago. But as I looked into it further as a scholar, as a historian myself, what was striking to me and is striking to me is that the thrust of the agenda is so much different from the religious right today. In fact, it's 188 degrees different in many respects. What strikes me about evangelical political activism in the 19th century is that evangelicals were concerned with those on the margins of society, those Jesus called the least of these. And so you have this robust agenda of social reform in the 19th century that is directed toward the abolition of slavery. Obviously, in the North, there were Southern evangelical defenders of slavery. I'm not trying to gloss over that point. That's a very important point. But in the North, evangelicals were opposed to slavery. Evangelicals generally were interested in prison reform. The whole idea of a penitentiary begins to emerge early in the 19th century, a place where a social deviant or a criminal can go not merely to be segregated from society, but to be rehabilitated, to become penitent, so that he, or perhaps she, could at some point constructively re-engage in society. Peace crusades in the early part of the 19th century were populated by evangelicals. I've even run across a gun control organization sponsored by evangelicals in the 19th century.
Wow.
Public schools, known as common schools in the 19th century, were very much an evangelical obsession, because evangelicals recognized that education was the way for the children of those less fortunate to become upwardly mobile and move into the middle class. And prominently, women's equality, including voting rights, which in the 19th century was a radical idea. But evangelicals were very much behind these sorts of movements. So when I juxtapose that social agenda and look at the political agenda of the religious right, I see this massive disconnect between these two movements, these two entities.
You point, as do quite a number of scholars to Tennessee, at least a historical episode in Tennessee, as a kind of a turning point between 19th century emphases in American evangelicalism and then what begins to be predominant in the latter part of the 20th century with the Scopes trial, right?
Exactly. I don't want to overemphasize the Scopes trial, but it is a kind of symbolic turning point, at least. And I think it was a turning point. And that is not to discount the fact that there were forces and factors that were kind of moving in that direction anyway. But what happens with the Scopes trial, again, at least symbolically, is that evangelicals begin to withdraw from the larger society. And there are several reasons for that. Kind of the background reason was the embrace of dispensational premillennialism.
Just a quick definition for those of you who might need a refresher on your American church history. Premillennialism is the theological doctrine which claims that human history will continue to devolve, grow more and more ungodly until Christ returns and establishes the millennium, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. Jesus could return at any moment, and little can be done to ameliorate or mitigate its thought social evil. More on the definition of this term in a moment. Back to the interview.
But the embrace of premillennialism by evangelicals, in effect, absolved them from the task of social reform. Why reform society if Jesus is going to come back at any moment? I call it a theology of despair, because it says, in effect, there's nothing we can do to make this world a better place. All we can do is hope to convert as many people as we can and wait for Jesus to come back and rain judgment on our enemies and take us out of here. So it's a kind of escapist sort of ideology. And so that was very much in play among evangelicals in the 1920s, perhaps even more in the North than in the South, but it was still part of their ideology. And then the Scopes trial itself and the kind of scorn heaped upon evangelicals by H.L. Mencken from the Baltimore Sun, who had this wicked wit.
Searing, ugly wit, yeah.
It really was. Yeah. And the effect was that evangelicals after 1925 begin to withdraw into their own world and begin constructing what I call the evangelical subculture in America, which is this vast and interlocking network of denominations, congregations, Bible camps, Bible institutes, seminaries, missionary societies, publishing houses. And this subculture, especially in the North where I grew up, and maybe a little bit less so in the South where you have the Southern Baptist Convention, which is sort of the established religion of the South. But in the North, it was possible to grow up within that subculture and have very, very little commerce with anyone outside of that world. Yeah. Now, I went to public schools, and I'm proud of that. I'm a product of public education, and I'm a fierce defender of public education. But my network of friends was dictated by my church and those networks rather than the larger world. So that was fairly typical for evangelicals in the middle decades of the 20th century. And politically, what it meant is that many evangelicals didn't bother to vote, certainly not in any organized way until the 1970s. Many of them were not even registered to vote. Politics was regarded as Satan's domain, and nothing good can come of it. And besides, Jesus is coming back at any moment, so let's not worry about this present world. Let's focus on the world to come and try to convert as many people as possible before Jesus returns.
Two things I want to point to quickly. One is that you referred to premillennialism a moment ago and acknowledged that, lots of people don't have the slightest idea perhaps what premillennialism is or designates these days. But you've got postmillennialism in the 19th century, premillennialism coming in early 20th century. And it's just worth noting that public ignorance of theology really doesn't do anybody any good when you have huge cultural and social implications from something like postmillennialism and premillennialism, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is a massive shift that takes place over the course of the 19th century. The social reform efforts were animated by postmillennialism. And just to provide a gloss on that without getting too deeply into the weeds, postmillennialism holds that we can, with God's help, construct a godly society, bring about the kingdom of God here on earth, and in the 19th century, more particularly here in America, by reforming society according to the norms of godliness. What happens over the course of the 19th century, of course, is that evangelicals begin to lose confidence in that process. And that had to do with a lot of things going on in the 19th century. The Civil War, the ravages of the Civil War, and you look at the casualties of the Civil War. I mean, it's just staggering when you think about the numbers. Historians now estimate something like 750,000 casualties in the Civil War. And on top of that, or subsequent to that, you have urbanization, industrialization, the influx of non-Protestant immigrants, who, by the way, did not share evangelical scruples about temperance.
Yeah.
And so by the late 19th centuries, by 1880, 1890, certainly, evangelicals are saying, wait a minute, we thought we were building this godly society by reforming society according to the norms of godliness. But the tenements on the Lower East Side of Manhattan don't exactly resemble the precincts of Zion. So maybe we need to rethink this. And then along comes this British interpreter of the Bible, John Nelson Darby, who says to American evangelicals, you've been interpreting the Bible all wrong. Jesus is not going to come back after you construct this millennial kingdom. Jesus is coming back before the millennium, that is premillennialism. And so that just changed the whole dynamic. And evangelicals at that point began to say, wait a minute, let's not waste our time trying to feed the poor or take care of the needy. Let's instead look toward this coming kingdom and forget about reforming society.
And there's almost oftentimes a presumption that things are going to naturally get worse before the return of Christ in premillennial.
Dwight Moody said exactly that. He said, I don't find anywhere in the, I'm paraphrasing here, but I don't find anywhere in the Bible where it says things are going to get better. Things are going to get worse and worse until Jesus returns. And that sets the tone for premillennialism.
Yeah. I'll insert another parenthetical here about the ways in which anti-intellectualism that refuses to take history seriously and that refuses to take theological education seriously can't see the way in which major historical and theological movements do impact the way we read the Bible. And if you're not aware of that stuff, then you can get wrought up in yet one more thing rolling down the pike without having any sort of resources to deal with some sort of major shift like this.
No, you're absolutely right about that. And I think that's what is fueling some of this conspiracy thinking on the part of many evangelicals today. They're not taking account of historical contingencies and historical circumstances.
So let's move then forward to the perceived origins myth, as you call it, of the religious right. That it's Roe v. Wade is the assumption that is the reason behind the rise of the religious right. You sketch out, I think, what to many people, and was to me before reading some of your work on this and hearing you talk about this in years past, I think a lot of people are surprised that there was a lot of diversity among evangelicals about the issue of abortion, even into the 1970s.
Oh, absolutely. 1968, Christianity Today, which is kind of the flagship magazine for evangelicalism, together with another evangelical group called the Christian Medical Society, had a conference. And they invited the top theologians and ethicists from the evangelical world to discuss the whole issue of abortion and also contraception, but abortion was prominent in their conversations. And these heavyweight theologians met over several days. And at the end of that gathering, they issued a statement saying, we really can't come to any conclusion on whether or not abortion is morally justified, but we're inclined to think it is, and it should be allowed. Two successive editors of Christianity Today magazine, both Carl F. H. Henry and his successor, Harold Lindsell, issued statements that countenance the legality of abortion. The Southern Baptist Convention. I think you've heard of that, right? Haven't you?
We have heard of that. We have heard of that in Nashville, yes.
Not exactly a redoubt of liberalism. Passed a resolution at their gathering in 1971 in St. Louis, Missouri, calling for the legalization of abortion. A resolution they reaffirmed. In 1974, again in 1976. This is, of course, after the Roe v. Wade ruling. When the Roe v. Wade decision was handed down, W.A. Criswell, former president of the Southern Baptist Convention, pastor of First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, issued a statement praising the Roe v. Wade ruling. I could go on and on. There are other examples as well. And all of that I cite in the book as a way of saying, wait a minute, abortion was not the catalyst here for this political movement. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February 26, 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade ruling. So actually, in the course of putting this book together, what I found is that the first prominent evangelical voice against abortion was Mark Hatfield, U.S. Senator, Republican from Oregon, who, again, like William Jennings Bryan, would be considered a leftist today,
right,
with his politics, including his pacifism. Mark Hatfield was the first prominent evangelical voice to oppose abortion. And that, I think, tells you something about that particular issue.
If I remember correctly, in many of those sources that you cite from those late 60s and 70s, there wasn't a move to see abortion as just a flippant exercise, right? It wasn't advocated for, say, contraception, but there were certain exceptions within which they thought abortion could be legitimate, including the mental and psychological health of a mother.
That was the language of the Southern Baptist Convention, certainly, yes. The mouth. Yes, no evangelical that I have encountered was saying, hey, abortion's this kind of guilt-free, as you say, contraceptive action. Nobody was saying that. But, and the larger context here, let's be clear about it, was that evangelicals considered abortion a Catholic issue throughout the 1970s. It was not something that they were terribly concerned about.
Yeah. So what really happened, you suggest, is Green v. Connolly, right?
Right.
Which is a court case that probably most of us have no idea what that is.
Exactly, right. Yeah, the catalyst for the religious right was a court case, but it was not Roe v. Wade in January of 1973. It was instead a lower court ruling, District Court, District of Columbia, that was issued on June 30th, 1971, in a case called Green v. Connolly. The background for Green v. Connolly, well, the deep background, of course, was the Brown v. Board of Education ruling of May 17th, 1954, that mandated public schools to be desegregated with all deliberate speed, in the phrase of the Supreme Court. And then the second historical background for that would be the Civil Rights Act of 1964, signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, that forbade discrimination in public institutions. As various school districts throughout the country, mainly in the South, but not exclusively in the South, began to desegregate, there was a movement or a rise of so-called segregation academies, most of them church-sponsored, that would provide all-white education for students. And in Holmes County, Mississippi, the first year of desegregation, the number of white students in the public schools dropped from over 600 to 28.
Wow.
The second year of desegregation, the number of white students in the public schools dropped to 0. At the same time, in Holmes County, there were 3 church-related segregation academies that applied to the IRS for tax-exempt status. And a group of parents in Holmes County said, this isn't right. We need to challenge this. And so they filed suit to stop the IRS from granting tax-exempt status to these segregation academies. That suit was joined with another suit. There's a long judicial history here. But the case finally ends up in the District Court for the District of Columbia. And on June 30th, 1971, the District Court said, in effect, that any organization that engages in racial segregation or racial discrimination is not, by definition, under the law, a tax-exempt organization, and therefore it should be denied tax-exempt status. Similarly, any contributions coming into such organizations would no longer qualify for tax exemption. As the IRS, over the course of the 1970s, began to enforce that Green v. Connolly ruling from 1971, it focused on such places as, for example, Bob Jones University in Greenville, South Carolina, which famously and defiantly from its origins had been racially segregated. I mean, not even segregated. They didn't allow Black students into the student body at all. What happens then, again, there's a lot more detail here, but let me just kind of get to the point. What happens then is that after years of warnings, the IRS finally rescinds the tax exemption for Bob Jones University on January 19th, 1976. That is what gets the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia. And he begins to band together with the encouragement of Paul Weyrich with other evangelical leaders to form a political movement to oppose the IRS. That was the catalyst for the religious right. It had nothing whatsoever to do with abortion. And we can talk about how abortion gets figured into this agenda a little bit later. But my point here, and the big point behind the book, is to substantiate that abortion had nothing to do with the genesis of the religious right. It was added only later in the 1970s, frankly, to provide a bit of respectability to the movement. Because Paul Weyrich and others recognized that if they were going to mobilize grassroots evangelicals, they needed an issue other than abortion to rally the faithful.
You are listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life. We are most grateful to have you joining us. If you have not yet done so, please subscribe today to the Tokens Podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. We'd love to hear from you. Send us feedback at podcast@Tokenshow. And also remember, you can sign up for our email list and find out how to join us for a live event. We've got some wonderful live events coming up. Find out more at tokensshow.com. This is our interview with Randall Balmer on his new book, Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. Coming up, we'll hear more about the surprising and troubling origins of the so-called religious right in the 1970s and 80s. Part 2 in just a moment. You're listening to Tokens and our interview with Randall Balmer. What would you say in response to someone who might reply to the narrative you just shared? Imagine that they say something like, okay, I hear what you're saying, but it's one thing for someone to be defending segregation as such, and it's another thing for someone to be concerned about the federal government telling us what we might be able to do as a private Christian institution. And that by the time this gets to a broader audience, that a lot of people are ignorant or unaware of the fact that there's racial undertones or racial roots to this particular concern with the intrusion, well, I'll put that in scare quotes, the intrusion of the federal government.
Yeah, I take that point, and I think that was part of the genius of Paul Weyrich and others, was to reframe that conversation. And let me deepen your observation here by recalling that I remember many times during my childhood growing up, my father was a minister in the Evangelical Free Church for 40 years. And I recall many, many times when there would be a pastor of a Bible institute or a Bible school who would come by, usually on a Sunday evening for a Sunday evening service, and he would present his school, trying to recruit students, raise money for the school, and so forth. And one of the appeals was always, we don't accept any money from the federal government, therefore the government can't tell us how to run our shop, who to hire and fire, who to admit or not to admit to our school. That was always a point of pride. So I understand that. But let's also remember that tax exemption is a form of public subsidy. If a church or a university or a Bible institute does not pay taxes, as they don't, as tax-exempt institutions. That means they're not paying for national defense. They're not paying for national parks. They're not paying the local government for fire protection or police services or local parks and so forth. It means that other taxpayers have to subsidize these nonprofit institutions. And I'm not taking an issue with that. I think the founders recognized the value of voluntary associations and sought to encourage that. And so I'm not taking issue with that. But for those same institutions to turn around and say, the federal government can't have any say whatsoever in how we run our institutions, I think is disingenuous. So that would be my response to
Yeah. Thank you. So let's go back to what you began to allude to a moment ago, and that is, how does abortion then become such a major issue for the evangelical right?
What happens is in the 1978 midterm elections, Paul Weyrich, this individual who was really the genius behind the religious right, he goes to the head of the Republican National Committee, who was Bill Brock, former senator from Tennessee.
Yeah.
And he goes to Brock because he wants money to try to mobilize these evangelical voters. And Brock says, who are these people? I'm not going to give you this money. And so Weyrich became rather defiant at that point. And he said, I'm going to go out and elect some rather improbable people in 1978. So he focuses on 4 Senate races. One of them's in New Hampshire. One of them is in Iowa. And then 2 of them are in Minnesota. One of them for the unexpired term of Walter Mondale, who, of course, was Jimmy Carter's vice president. And in all 4 of those Senate races, the Democratic candidates were considered the front runners by the polls, by the pundits, everybody. They all thought, in Iowa, for example, the incumbent senator was Dick Clark. Not that Dick Clark, but different Dick Clark, who had won election 6 years earlier with 55% of the vote. No poll going into the midterm election in 1978 showed him leading by fewer than 10 percentage points. But on the final weekend of the campaign, pro-lifers, Roman Catholics, leafleted church parking lots in those states. And 2 days later, in an election with a very low turnout, which tends to be the case for midterm elections, all 4 of those leading Democratic candidates lost to anti-abortion Republicans. I remember going through Paul Weyrich's papers. Actually, they're out at the University of Wyoming in Laramie, and looking at his correspondence around Election Day, 1978. It's almost like the papers start to sizzle because he realizes he's got the issue.
He's got the issue.
This is going to work for him politically, and he doesn't have to kind of flog this new political movement on the basis of defending racial segregation. He can have a more high-minded issue that would work with evangelical voters. That said, I have to add that even as late as August 1980, during the Carter-Reagan campaign, when Carter is running for re-election, Reagan addresses this group of evangelicals, somewhere between 10 and 20,000, that I've seen different estimates, at Reunion Arena in Dallas on August 22nd. This is where he famously said, I know this group can't endorse me, but I want you to know that I endorse you and what you're doing. Brought down the house and probably sealed the evangelical.
Brilliant rhetoric, yeah.
Brilliant rhetoric. He was coached extensively, believe me, on that. But he delivered his lines flawlessly. I mean, he's an actor, so he was very good. I went through his address out at the Reagan Presidential Library. And in that address, he talks about creationism. He says that if he were on a desert island, the one book he would want with him is the Bible. He decries the Internal Revenue Service for trying to enforce anti-segregation statutes at these evangelical institutions. He does not mention abortion even once. That's August 22nd, 1980. Even by then, the Reagan-Bush campaign was not certain that abortion would work for them as a political issue.
So, two quick notes here. One is that you said that those 4 Senate races, those were New Hampshire, Iowa, and 2 in Minnesota?
Yes.
So the religious right really, with its concern about abortion, really comes out of the North, Randall. It doesn't come from the South.
Yeah. No, it
That's amazing. Here's the second thing. We just recently have on our podcast an interview with Bill Kavanaugh, who had a fascinating recent article. What was it in? America, the Jesuit magazine.
Yep.
Kavanaugh, who's a good pro-life Catholic, the article is something like, Roe v. Wade hasn't worked. It's time we change our strategy. And he talks about how 50 of the last 51 years, there's been a majority of Republican appointee Supreme Court justices.
Yes.
And that in 1973, when Roe v. Wade passed or was ruled on, it was a 7-2 vote. The Republican had 6 appointees on the Supreme Court in that 7-2 vote, and one of the votes against Roe v. Wade was one of the Democrat appointees.
Yes.
And then how all these years you have a majority of Supreme Court appointees by the Republicans, and yet they've never changed the policy. And so it points to this sort of thing that you're pointing to, I think, with Paul Weyrich, is that this seems to be more an issue of trying to galvanize a voter base, and even, I might use stronger language, of use a group of people as opposed to having a commitment to a moral practice in pro-life. Do you think that's a fair way to put it?
I do. And I think one of the tragedies of the religious right and it tethering itself to the abortion issue is that the debate around abortion has become so stale and so, I would even say, morally bankrupt because it has become so politicized. And Weyrich is in part, he may be the one more than anyone else is responsible for that. That is to make this kind of bedrock connection between the far right reaches of the Republican Party and the anti-abortion movement. In the early years, as Daniel Williams from Georgia State University has pointed out, in the early years of the abortion debate in the 1970s, it was by no means skewed along party lines or even along ideological lines. And I mean, one of the reasons we know that is people like Ted Kennedy and Joe Biden himself were against abortion initially early in the 1970s. It's only because of the kind of crass politicization or partisanization of the movement that you have these sort of party lines determining how the vote goes. And I'm not blaming only the Republican Party on this. I think the Democratic Party is also responsible for not engaging in a robust moral debate over this. And the bottom line for me, as a Christian, as a believer, is I think abortion is a moral issue. It's not a legal issue. It's a moral issue. And if we're serious about reducing the incidence of abortion in this country, the way to approach it is not through the law, but through morality and through a moral persuasion. My shorthand on this, I know we're getting off topic here, but my shorthand on this is that I have no interest in making abortion illegal. I would like to make it unthinkable. And that's a different approach to the entire issue. And, just we're getting a little bit off topic here, and I'm sorry about this, but the Catholic bishops recently coming after Joe Biden for the abortion issue and talking about denying him access to Holy Communion and that sort of thing. Well, Catholic teaching also prohibits capital punishment. When is the last time the bishops went after Catholic politicians who support the death penalty? I understand the arguments that there's not a total moral parity between abortion and capital punishment, but still, consistency, I think, has a place.
Yeah. What do you hope for going forward?
Lee, that's a really good question. I guess when I look at my career, at least the last couple of decades of my career, one of my overriding aspirations has been to call evangelicals back to their better selves and say, look, you have a history, you have a tradition that is really quite noble when you think about evangelical activism in the 19th and early 20th centuries. And somehow you've gone off the rails. And, again, I think 1980 is really the turning point for that. And I at least until recently, I've held out hope that the course could be reversed. I've written elsewhere that 2016 really represents the end of evangelicalism, at least in any meaningful sense, the 2016 election. Having said that, I'm also, as you pointed out, a minister, a preacher, and I read in the New Testament that Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, even though his body had begun to stink. And if Jesus can do that, Jesus can resurrect evangelicalism as well. I have to allow for that possibility. So what I hope, first of all, I hope that readers will come to terms with this movement, the genesis of this movement. Now, it's legitimate to ask, even though this movement has rather specious origins, does that mean the movement itself is entirely compromised? And no, I'm not willing to say that. But nevertheless, you could have this very, very beautiful structure with all sorts of architectural baubles, and it looks magnificent from afar. But if it's constructed on faulty, rotten timbers, in this case, racism, I think the entire structure is compromised, and I think we need to come to terms with that. So I guess that the initial takeaway would be for evangelicals to come to terms with, to acknowledge the real origins of this movement, and then to consider very carefully how such an acknowledgement will affect their attitude toward and their participation in such a movement.
Yeah.
And I think the Trump presidency kind of brought it all to light in many ways and allowed the religious right finally to abandon the fiction that this was a movement based in any way on family values. You just can't make that argument and then go to the voting booth and pull the lever for Donald Trump. There's just no moral credibility to that argument. So that's the first step, I think.
Let me ask one or two more personal questions. You earlier alluded to early 20th century premillennialism as something like a theology of despair with regard to sociopolitical change. And I wonder, for you as an academic who has done the kind of work that you've done, and you're looking carefully at the growth of social developments and seeing the complexity and oftentimes the ugly underbelly of these things, do you find yourself getting tempted towards despair?
I try to resist that. I think anybody who is a parent does not have the luxury of despair. That is to say, I think I have a responsibility for trying to leave the world at least a marginally better place than when I found it. And particularly because I have children, I think I have to work toward that end. And despair is a lovely sort of redoubt, I think. It's very comfortable. But I don't think it is a realistic alternative, especially for a person of faith. And we have to, I think Jesus calls us toward making a better world. And so that's what I've tried to do, I think, in my own very, very modest way. You can see how well it's working in terms of redirecting evangelicals away from what I consider their misbegotten political activity over the last several years. But, Jacques Ellul says that it's incumbent on the believer to preach the gospel. And even though we don't control in any way how that gospel is received, we still have to preach the gospel.
Well, Jacques Ellul is always a fine place to end. So we thank you. We've been talking with Randall Balmer on his new book, Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. Randall, it's always a pleasure to get to talk to you. Thank you for your work, and thanks for the conversation.
Lee, you're terrific. Thanks so much. Enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. You've been listening to Tokens, Public Theology, Human Flourishing, and the Good Life, and our interview with Randall Balmer on his new book, Bad Faith, Race, and the Rise of the Religious Right. If you're interested in additional episodes related to American politics and the religious right, you might want to check out our episode with Kristen Dumais on her book, Jesus and John Wayne. as well as our interview with Beth Barr on her book, The Making of Biblical Womanhood, How the Subjugation of Women Became Gospel Truth. If you have not yet done so, subscribe today to the Tokens Podcast on Apple, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your favorite podcasts. If you've got feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Email us text or attach a voice memo and send to the address podcast@tokenshow.com. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this podcast possible. Executive producer and manager Christy Bragg of Bragg Management, co-producer Jacob Lewis of Great Feeling Studios, associate producers Ashley Bain, Leslie Thompson, Tom Anderson, and Brad Perry, our engineer Carrie Harmon, music beds by Zach and Maggie White, and our live event production team at Stonebrook Media, led by Phil Barnett. Thanks for listening, and peace be unto thee. The Tokens Podcast is a production of Tokens Media LLC and
Great Feeling Studios.